Hey everyone, welcome to a second video for chapters 14 and 15, Conquest of the Americas. So in this video we're going to be discussing how the Spanish and to a lesser extent the Portuguese conquered huge areas of the Americas, as well as the huge impact they had on the Native American peoples who are already living there. Let's start off by giving some basic statements about the first meetings. As we discussed in the last video, European conquest of the Americas began with Christopher Columbus, and his voyage began a cycle of encounter, conquest, and death for Native Americans. Now, this statement I got directly from the textbook, and I always thought it was a very accurate way of describing the impact Columbus had on Native Americans. Columbus should definitely not be remembered as a hero, but his voyage was monumental. Unfortunately for Native Americans, it was monumentally destructive. After he returned to Spain with stories of riches of the New World, many other conquistadors set off for fame and fortune. Now, conquistadors, known for their distinctive helmets, let me just move me out of the way, there they are, is a term for Spanish conquer, which really tells you why this time period should be called the Age of European Conquest rather than European exploration. So conquistadors started coming in large numbers, and they began, there we go, claiming large pieces of land for Spain, and they treated the Native Americans as inferior. They considered themselves to be civilized. They believed that because they were Christian, that they were better than the heathen Native Americans, and so that explains the logic in why they oppressed and exploited the Native Americans so much. Now, we're going to be talking about two specific conquistadors, and the first one is this guy, Hernan Cortes. Now, Cortes was inspired by Columbus's voyage, and he traveled to Mexico in 1519. Now, you should remember back from chapter 6 that during that time, much of Mexico was under control of the Aztecs. Now, remember the Aztecs, how much they loved sacrificing people and ripping their hearts out. And shortly after landing in Mexico, he traveled to the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. And we learned about this very impressive city in chapter 6, how it was larger than most cities in Europe at that time. And Cortes met with the Emperor Moctezuma. Again, let me move me. There we go. And Moctezuma angrily kicked Cortes and his conquistadors out, but they weren't done. Cortes went around the surrounding... There we go. He went around these surrounding areas and made alliances with people who were conquered or simply not big fans of the aggressively conquering Aztecs. It probably wasn't too hard to find people who didn't like the Aztecs, considering how much the Aztecs loved ripping hearts out of people's chests. So, by the year 1521, Cortes and his conquistadors and his Native American allies returned to Tenochtitlan and successfully capture it. The royal family is killed, much of the Aztec riches are plundered, and Tenochtitlan never recovers. So Mexico is now officially part of the Spanish Empire. The other conquistador is Francisco Pizarro. Now Pizarro had his sights set on the big empire in South America, which hopefully you remember from learning about in chapter 6. It was the Inca Empire. So in 1532, he led the conquest of the Inca Empire using similar tactics as Cortes in Mexico. He successfully conquered the Inca, killed their emperor in the process, and in doing so, he was able to claim the Pacific coast of South America for Spain. So you look all along the coast here, that was the Inca Empire. In countries today, that would mostly be Peru and Chile, and so that adds a big chunk of the New World to the Spanish Empire. Now, before we learn a little bit more about what this empire was like, it's first very important to go over the reasons for the Spanish success. First of all, they had superior weapons, gunpowder technology, they had iron armor. Native Americans had not developed the use of iron. They had horses. This seems like it wouldn't be much of an advantage until you remember that horses didn't exist in the Americas. Big European war horses gave the Spanish a pretty big advantage in battle. Another reason was the alliances the Spanish made with other Native American groups. The Spanish deceived many of these groups into thinking that they would be better off after the Aztec and Inca were gone, when in reality they helped bring about their one conquest and led it into another by the Spanish. And lastly, but definitely not least, disease. Disease played a huge role. The Spanish had guns and cannons, but they were vastly outnumbered. Guns, cannons, armor, horses, and allies still would not have been enough to defeat the Aztec and Inca. By far the most deadly weapon the Europeans brought with them was one they didn't even know they had. So you can see this. Okay. Europeans had built up immunity to diseases like influenza and smallpox that devastated Native American populations. Millions of them died from these diseases, making it much easier to conquer them. So after a fairly short amount of time, Spain had built up a pretty big empire in the Americas. Look at the map here. This is what their empire looked like at its highest, at its extent in the 1700s. So it's not quite at this point in the time period we're talking about yet. But big chunks of the Caribbean, most of it, all of Central America, huge sections of South America. Remember this right here, Brazil, that went to Portugal. And what we forget about a lot of times is huge sections of North America as well. All of this was Spain. And that's why all of this would be Mexico when Mexico gains its independence, and it would remain Mexico up until the 1840s. So they controlled pretty much the entire Pacific coast, all the way from Canada down to the bottom of South America. Now, let's go over a couple of important aspects of these colonies. First one being their government. Now, Spain directly controlled its colonies. It wanted to get as much money out of them as possible. Colonies were overseen by a viceroy or a royal governor who spoke with the authority of the king back in Spain. Another important aspect of Spanish colonies was religion, especially Catholicism. Spreading Catholicism was a priority for the Spanish, more so than the French and the British colonists who arrived later. Priests often traveled with the conquistadors, and they worked to convert the Native Americans, oftentimes by force. Now, I mentioned before that Spain wanted to get as much money out of these colonies as possible. The primary way this was accomplished was through this thing called the Encomienda system. Let me move me up here so I know I'll be out of the way of later stuff. Now, under this system, large plantations were developed to farm cash crops. Now, cash crops are crops grown strictly to make money from, such as cotton or sugar. And because these plantations were so large, they required large amounts of labor, way more than could be provided by Spanish settlers. So the Encomienda system gave Spanish plantation owners the right to demand labor from Native Americans, like you see here in this picture. All right, but that's the important thing about the word Encomienda. It wasn't the plantation specifically, it was this right that they felt they had to demand labor from the Native Americans. Now you look at the graphic here. This is what they would, is how the Spanish would sell it. They would say the Spanish settlers protect, care for, and Christianize Indians, and then Indians work a portion of their time for Spanish settlers. Okay, that doesn't sound so bad. The reality of it, though, is that Spanish settlers force long labor, don't pay Indian workers, fail to protect Indians and seize their land, and then the Native Americans die from disease and harsh living and working conditions. So it was not good for them. Now, culturally, you saw a huge blending of different groups, namely European, Native American, and African. Now, this resulted in blended cultures that are still seen in Latin America today. Excuse me. Now, the blending was often the result of intermarrying between the different groups, like you see here in this picture. And I'm going to come back to that in a second, because I want to talk about the social class structure that was based on race. Now, you've got the pyramid, and you've got these different groups. Let's go over what a lot of these groups mean, because outside of Africans and natives, you guys probably are not familiar with what any of these words mean. The first one, the Peninsulares. These were Europeans who were born in Europe and considered to be the most pure blood. Beneath them were the Creoles. Creoles were European blood, but born in the colonies. So these were the descendants of the Peninsulares. Now, typically a child or a grandchild of a Peninsular might not be considered a Creole, right, if they were within 1 or 2 generations. But Creoles started to view themselves as being separate from the European ancestors once you started to get multiple generations apart from the European ancestors. Now, beneath them were the mestizos and the mulattoes. Mestizos were a mix of Native American and European blood, while mulattoes were a mix of European and African. It was not unheard of for Spanish and Portuguese settlers to take a native woman for a bride, producing mestizos, like you see in these pictures. Unfortunately, mulattoes were often the result of a European slave owner having his way with a female African slave. Mestizos and mulattoes were very rarely accepted by either Creole or Peninsular society as being fully European, so they were considered racially inferior. And down at the very, very bottom, you had African slaves and then the natives themselves. Okay, so that wraps things up for this section. A lot to cover, but I just wanted to kind of combine a couple of elements from different sections in the chapters. And in the next video, we're going to be talking about the Atlantic slave trade.